Let's check why Ganister PLM documentation is so resilient. When we built the Ganister PLM documentation, we had three goals in mind so that we can build the best and the most resilient PLM documentation. First one, it had to be light. So the format had to be light. It's not like a Word document where you have tons of data that you don't really care inside the document. So it had to be very light so that you could do diffs of documents. The second item was that we wanted it to be customizable so that you can configure your own documentation. We have lots of elements in the documentation that are based on default settings for the application, but when you will be configuring the solution, you will want to adapt the documentation to what you've been building. And the third thing is the searchability. If you add more and more things in your documentation, then your users will want to have a quick access to the answers they look for when they look at your documentation. So they don't have to search or to read the whole documentation to find an answer. They need to search it. So the main general documentation is here. And you can have, if you're an admin or if you're technical and you have access to the gconfig, you have another documentation, which is a tech documentation, pretty much the same concept. It's just two different locations so that you split your documentation for most of the users, and on the other side, a documentation for only tech access. If we go back to the general documentation, so you have folders, you have articles, and that's where you could add some documentation. The format is very light. This is Markdown. It's used by GitHub, Stack Overflow, many web platforms because it's easy to diff. So if you make changes, it will be easy to see the difference between what you've done and our latest update, for example. But if you're worried about writing documentation in a Markdown format or any format that is not like Word document, we use a solution called Typora. It's an open source software that helps you writing Markdown. So you see you don't have any specific thing to Markdown to care about because it does all the work for you. If you want to see what Markdown looks like, here you have the pound sign for a title one. You can build lists, etc. It's pretty simple, but with this type of tool you don't even have to care about it. So let's see an example where you want to create your own in your own data. For example, you create elevator corp, and inside this you're going to write elevator.md, and in this file so if you know the syntax for Markdown, you can write it down here and say my corp title. But if you don't know it, instead of typing the syntax, you can just say this is a second title, and you just say, well, this is the French version, but you have title too. This is about elevators. Okay, save it. Once you save it, it recompiles and you can go back to your documentation, refresh it, and you should see here your folder and your page here. and saying my cop title is about elevators. So pretty quickly you can build your documentation. If you get updates from, for example, if you update your Ganister instance, you will have a moment in the upgrade process. You will have the choice to select some of these updates, and mainly around documentation. You will be able to define what you want to keep and what you don't want to keep. And so this is when you will be able to diff these files and keep your documentation up to date. The other great thing that we have here is that if you're, for example, here and your users are looking for elevators, you see that it has been indexed in our system. So all the search, it's not like indexing just what we're writing in the documentation, but whatever you're writing will be taken into account in this search feature. So this is why we believe this is a very resilient documentation system, very light, which will help you to keep your documentation up to date and really in sync with whatever customization you will add to your Ganister PLM implementation.